Hello, my friends across the fruited and rooted plain. It's time for the Gardening Simplified Show with Stacy Hervella, me, Rick Weist, and our engineer and producer, Adriana Robinson, as we broadcast from Studio A here at Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs. Today, initially, Stacy, we banter about annual plants. Annual plants, those one-season plants that, well, die when it gets cold later this year. They'll germinate, flower, some set seed, and then die all in one season, but they're worth it. And in the flower business, we always had a saying, annual plants don't come back, so you come back.
Gotta love it.
I love it. I love it. And they're worth it, okay? Flowering annuals are worth it. You think about this. If you go to the movies, okay? $12 for a ticket, let's say. $8 for popcorn, $6 for a soda. $5 for a box of Skittles, Nerds, or Whoppers. That's $31 a person for 2 to 3 hours worth of entertainment.
You know, that's a great way to look at it.
I sneak chocolate into the theater, by the way. I always have a few Twix under my sleeves.
I was going to say, Rick, you're telling on yourself because you're pretty recognizable, and, you know, those movie theater managers are going to see you coming.
I know.
Fortunately, you turned it into a pun. Well, you know what? I think that, you know, it's Memorial Day weekend. This is like the Super Bowl of the gardening season. And you don't have to twist my arm into the fact that annuals are absolutely worth it. You know, when you, especially I think if you live in a cold climate, and I know we have a lot of listeners in warm climates, but especially for those of us who have relatively short summers, we've got to make hay while the sun shines, so to speak, and get that color. We don't have the benefit of colorful flowers like bougainvillea in the middle of winter and things like that. So, you know, this is our opportunity to briefly pretend that we live in a warm climate and can have bright, colorful flowers around us.
Our time to shine. Annuals are great because they're easy to grow favorites for both new and experienced gardeners, and you can experiment. You're not making a lifetime commitment here, okay? You're just having some fun with annuals, and they're very entertaining. You can experiment with different plants, color schemes, color, you know, something more risky than gray or beige. I mean, if you're flipping houses, grayish is fine, but out in the garden, let's have some fun with annuals.
Yeah, it's very low stakes. And, you know, I always said, my mom always planted the same thing. When I was growing up, she always planted the same annuals. She planted red geraniums with a spike and white alyssum around it, and it was lovely. And I always said, as I became a horticulturist, I'm never going to do the same thing. But I have found myself often repeating my favorites because I love them so much. And I look forward to seeing them like a friend every season. I look forward to looking out my back door and seeing my vermilion ercufia in bloom with the hummingbirds swarming at it. And I do try to always try something new every season, but I do have my standards. So that's vermilion ercufia for me. And if I can find it, the rockin' deep purple salvia.
Oh, love that.
Another one that's great for hummingbirds, and of course basil. But you know, basil's an annual, but also kind of an herb. So we're talking flowering annuals today, though.
Now, that's fantastic. I remember those geranium days, too, when I was a youngster working in the garden center as we approached this weekend. Everybody called it Decoration Day.
They did.
Not necessarily Memorial Day. Yeah, and there's a whole story behind that, but I won't go down that road. Although, you know, years ago, I was trained by this wonderful lady, hardworking lady. Her name was Doris, and she served in the Navy Waves, 1943 to 1946. Anyhow, working out there in the greenhouse and garden center with me, she was my mentor, trained me in flowering annuals, and those were the days of the Big Daddy petunias and the boy oh boy marigolds and the spikes and the geraniums. But she'd be out there in the hot weather wearing high heels and a dress, and she led the charge. There was no scuttlebutt there, no mutiny. She ran the show, and it was great. And you could always hear her coming, that click, click, click of her heels. And at the start of the day, she'd type up a work list, and at the end of the day, she'd type up a synopsis or a work list. Those lists on a typewriter, tap, 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 looked like a cross between a Western Union telegram and a ransom note. But I don't know why that popped into my head.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Doris would not be a fan, perhaps, of today's exuberant mixed containers without a lot of organization in them, where everything's kind of overflowing and competing for space, which I love that look, but it is a far cry from the way people used to plant containers.
Well, and of course, things have changed so much since then. And, petunias are a great example. She would have me deadheading those petunias, which were setting seed, the slimy, sweet smell. Oh,
the smell.
Boy.
You know what? Life is way, way too short for petunias. You have to deadhead.
I agree. And so in the mid-1990s, the wave petunias come along, but they get overgrown and they're grown from seeds. So then we now have the supertunias, Vista supertunias. The root system plays well with other plants. They bloom continually because they're sterile. I love the supertunia series of petunias.
You know, I think that it's not an exaggeration to say that the supertunia series, and particularly Supertunia Vista Bubblegum, has completely changed the way people think about petunias, because they did think about it just like you said. They smelled terrible. They're slimy. They're getting white fly. They need deadheading. They get scraggly. But the Supertunia series, it really is not an exaggeration to say that it is a truly innovative plant breeding invention that completely changes the way we think about it. And anyone who grows them or has grown them can agree that you really have to grow them to see how floriferous they are. And they don't set seed, so you don't have to deadhead them, and they just keep flowering. And if you like that pink, you are in business.
Oh, bubblegum, supertunias, love them. So, I look back through the years and I think about flowering annuals. I could talk for hours. I mean, you think about Impatiens Walleriana, and everybody planted them and they're colorful. And then 2012 comes along and we have impatient downy mildew that spreads like wildfire, changes the market. Now today, of course, we've got Rocapulco, we have Beacon, we have, of course, the sun patience. The market continues to change, and Stacy, we keep seeing great new varieties.
You know, the impatiens are another great example. And, back in the day, New Guinea impatiens weren't a thing, and that completely changed the way people think about impatiens as well. Now, I remember one year when I was growing up, and my mom would plant a row of impatiens in front of the privet hedge in front of our little ranch house there in Livonia, Michigan. And one year she picked these impatiens that set seed. Now, you know the impatiens seed heads, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Pop.
Yeah, they have this little funny shaped seed head that you can pop open when it's ripe. And every morning that summer, my brother and I would run out front to pop whichever had matured overnight. And you don't find those very often, which is a good thing from a gardener perspective, because that means they're putting their energy into flowering instead of setting those fun seeds. But I always like to find those around in planters and do a little bit of impatiens popping.
It is fun. They have this impatient nature. They pop. And by the way, going back to Doris, at the time she was my mentor, she was in her mid-60s.
Oh, wow.
And I was just a youngster. And she would call the impatiens Busy Lizzies.
That's a very old-fashioned name for them, but it's a fun one.
But it's a fun one, Busy Lizzies. Now, earlier, of course, Stacy, you mentioned the salvias like Blue Suede Shoes, Rockin' Fuchsia, Playing the Blues. I agree. Drawing hummingbirds. Annuals are great because they give you a splash of quick color. And talk about plants that help you draw butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds to your garden.
That's one of the reasons that I invest so much time and money into them, because it really is, most of my garden also is a little bit further out in my yard. And of course I walk out there all the time and see what's going on. But where we actually spend time on our patios and porch, that's where I put the annuals. So they're really right there around me. Yeah. It's a great way to be kind of up close and personal with the plants.
Well, and that's my point. The annuals are going to give you 4, 5, 6, 7 months of entertainment, as opposed to that movie ticket. And I'm not picking on the movies. I like the movies. But flowering annuals and working in your yard is rated G for gardening. And
it's a nonstop adventure is what it is.
It's a nonstop adventure. I think about, I love verbena, meteor shower, verbena, the sun-credible yellow sunflowers, the color blaze coleus. We could go on and on. And I want to remind folks, if you go to our website, gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, Stacy has her top 10 list of favorite annuals there, and so do I. So you can take a look at it. And boy, do some experimenting. We talked about the impatiens. There's so many great shade choices too, like the heart-to-heart caladiums. That's another favorite. So again, could talk for hours about this.
We could, and I wish we could. But we got other topics to cover.
We have other topics. As a matter of fact, plants on trial. I'm looking forward to Stacy's selection today. And stick around, too, because later on in the show, we're going to talk to a pollination expert. We'll talk bees and attracting pollinators to your yard. That's all coming up here on the Gardening Simplified show.
Greetings, gorgeous gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show. It's time of the show where we put a plant on trial and tell you all about one of the proven winners' color choice shrubs. But before we dive in, I do just want to speak directly to anybody who is out shopping for annuals this fine weekend, big annual garden center weekend. And that is to just have fun with it. I grew up, my mom would get so stressed out. And I don't know what this is, and should I try this? And I would just encourage people to approach that process much like shopping for clothes or shopping for something in your home. Look at colors that you like. Don't be afraid to try something new. What's the worst that's going to happen? And with annuals, if you decide that you tried something and you don't like the way it looks with something else, you can almost always move it.
Exactly. I can't agree more, Stacy. Like I said, for either new or experienced gardeners, it's a great time to experiment.
Right. So have fun with it. And that's what I'm going to be doing this weekend myself. So see you there. Anyway, when I was thinking about what plant to put on trial today, I was thinking about everything that you were saying about super petunias being really innovative, new plants that have really changed the way that people think about petunias. They're no longer this fussy little thing that, only flowers for a little while and needs a lot of maintenance. They're really this robust flower machine. Yeah. And so I wanted to talk about a shrub that has a similar innovative quality to it, and that is Steady Eddy viburnum.
Steady Eddy. I knew Steady Eddy.
You did?
Yeah.
My neighbor's named Eddy. But anyway, it's a beautiful plant. So Steady Eddy is a doublefile viburnum. And doublefile, if you're hearing this word, you're probably like, what in the world does that even mean? Well, it's kind of like a single file line, but double. So what doublefile viburnums got their name because the flower clusters come off the main branch in a line on either side. So you have a flower cluster coming off of each side of the branch, but then each of those forms a single file line. So you have a double file line, and it's very, very distinctive. It's unmistakable. When you see these in bloom, they have such a strong geometric quality, and that's where that funny word doublefile comes from.
It's like a horizontal tiered type of effect that you see with the flowering. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's absolutely eye-catching, and people love them. And Steady Eddy, what makes it so innovative, it is a doublefile viburnum, or Viburnum plicatum tomentosum, if we're being exact about it. But it is a reblooming doublefile viburnum. And I would actually go so far as to say it's nearly continuous blooming. This is one of the most powerfully reblooming shrubs that is in our line. I have to tell you, it's knocked my socks off. It's impressed me so much. So it blooms in late spring, as most other doublefile viburnums do. And here in Michigan, they're blooming now and looking absolutely fabulous. So it blooms now along with the other ones, and then it takes just a brief little break after that first round of flowers fades, and it keeps going. And I mean, it will go all the way through summer. I have seen this thing in the middle of July where you could have sworn if you didn't see the plants around it flowering that you'd be back in May.
What a bonus, because I grow viburnums more so for the fall color than I do the blooms, but the blooms, of course, are spectacular. And to have it bloom that long, what a bonus in the landscape.
It is. And, people love flowers, right? We know shrubs are useful garden plants, useful in the landscape, however you need to plant them and make it work for you. But everyone ultimately is after the flowers. So a viburnum that's going to give you more flowers, and especially when they are so beautiful and so showy, Steady Eddy viburnum is a great choice. Now, I'm sure you've encountered this at the garden center. A lot of people mistake Viburnum plicatum tomentosum for hydrangeas.
Yes.
And they say, I want one of those spring flowering hydrangeas. And they can't be blamed. They do very much superficially resemble hydrangeas. The flowers can be lace cap or mophead, as hydrangea flowers can.
Yep.
And particularly the mophead ones, they do look a lot like hydrangea flowers, but they actually are not remotely related botanically, just superficially. They have that resemblance. So Steady Eddy is one of those lace cap types. So you're getting that more open flower, which is, to some people's eye, not as showy as the mophead type, but has the benefit of attracting pollinators. Because a lace cap flower has its fertile flowers, the ones that have all of the pollen and nectar and everything in it to attract pollinators. Those are more exposed. They're not obscured by the larger, showier, sterile florets. And so it's much more attractive to pollinators. So if that's important to you, not only does Steady Eddy do that as a lace cap viburnum, it does it over a longer period because it's blooming clear through summer.
I agree. It's like a landing pad. Permission to buzz the tower. You know, that's why pollinators love them. It's fabulous.
And another great thing about Steady Eddy is it's not as large as your conventional viburnum plicatum tomentosum, which if you are seeing those around in your neighborhood or as you're driving around, you're like, whoa, that's a big fella. They can be, 8 to 10 feet tall
or
and
larger.
wide or larger, certainly if you find a very mature one. Whereas Steady Eddy is going to top out around 4 to 5 feet tall and wide. So it's much more usable in a typical residential landscape. It's much more in scale with the average home.
I love the name of the plant, Steady Eddy.
Well, it's called Steady Eddy because it just is so steadily blooming.
Yeah, if I could have a Cliff Clavin moment here. Remember Cliff Clavin from Cheers?
I do.
Yeah, always thinking about history and these odd facts in his head. When I hear Steady Eddy, I think of Eddie Murray. He was a first baseman for the Baltimore Orioles. Now, I loved baseball as a kid. I would listen to a little transistor radio with an earpiece, Ernie Harwell. And Cal Ripken Jr. was the shortstop. He was the Iron Man. He played more consecutive games than the iconic Lou Gehrig. But Eddie Murray was this guy that was always there, always dependable, year after year after year, always would get the big hit. Steady Eddy.
Oh, is that his nickname?
Eddie Murray.
Oh, I wonder if that... Gotta love it.
Yeah, Eddie Murray, which is pretty cool. I liked baseball as a kid. I love statistics, and I love the history of the game. And I'll leave you with this. Baseball is the only sport or game where the defense has possession of the ball. That's why I like it. Think about all other sports. The offense has possession of the ball. All right, this is a gardening show, not a sporting show. Stacy, continue.
But, gardening and baseball do go together very well. Because who doesn't like to work in the yard and have the ball game on and the smell of the cut grass? That's like the perfect summer day.
It's Americana. Americana.
Well, speaking of people, let's talk about where Steady Eddy came from, and that is the one and only Dr. Tom Rainey from North Carolina State University. And, an innovative plant can only come from an innovative breeder, and that is absolutely Dr. Rainey to a T. He has developed some of our most innovative flowering shrubs, from Invincible Spirit and the other pink Annabelle type hydrangeas that we have in the Invincible series here at Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs. Double take thornless double flowered quince.
Oh, I love that plant.
The Perfectamundo reblooming azaleas, which are not hardy for us here in Michigan, but are definitely making huge inroads in warmer climates. And that's just a few of the plants. He and his crew at the Mountain Horticultural Crops and Research Station in around Asheville, North Carolina, really just put their heads together to create some of the most spectacular plants that really solve problems. So similar to what happened with the Supertunias, Tom and his crew, Dr. Rainey, are really devoting their efforts and their knowledge to plants that do more for people because they know that's what people want. And even if you are a really experienced gardener and you say, oh, well, I don't need a reblooming viburnum. A viburnum that blooms once is just perfectly swell for me. I mean, are you really going to turn down the extra flowers?
No, of course not.
We're all here for the flowers.
That's
right. A big accomplishment from them. And we're really, really excited about this plant. It's available on the market now. And if you want to grow it, like most viburnums, it's pretty versatile and pretty easy to grow. Viburnums are well known for being very shade tolerant.
Yep.
And Steady Eddy, I would say, can easily take part sun or part shade. So those are interchangeable terms. So that's about 4 to 6 hours of bright sun every day. Any less than that, and you're going to start seeing fewer blooms. The plant will live and it will grow, but you're not going to see as many flowers. You're not going to see that coverage. So try to give it at least a good 4 hours of bright sun every day. Viburnums are generally known to be pretty drought tolerant once they're established. They definitely need some help getting there. But once, after they've been in the ground for 2 or 3 years and have a good root system developed, they don't necessarily need a whole lot of extra care. A good 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch should easily provide for all of their water needs. And of course, Steady Eddy does not need to be deadheaded or trimmed or anything like that to keep that flower show coming. So this is just one of those, I hesitate to use this phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway, set it and forget it type of plants. Now, when it comes to deer, I do want to mention viburnums are known to be deer resistant, and it's one of the things that really attracts people to them. Now, I did put Steady Eddy in my yard, which is teeming with deer. Not at any one given moment, but they visit frequently. And unfortunately, they ate the flowers. Okay. So they didn't really damage the plant much. The plant they left alone.
Which doesn't surprise me because, Stacy, at the outset, you said plicatum, tomentosum. Tomentosum being soft, hairy foliage. Plicatum is textured, ribbed kind of foliage,
and they do have very heavily ribbed foliage.
Yeah. So that's interesting.
So it's good to know that, and that's one of those tricky things about deer resistance is they don't damage the plant, but they do damage the flowers. So be aware of that. If you love this plant, which I absolutely do, you could certainly spray it if you wanted to grow it or just protect it, have it inside a fence. But that's sort of the last bit I have to share right now on Steady Eddy viburnum. But you can get lots more and as well as the beautiful photos of Steady Eddy viburnum at our website, gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. We're going to take a little bit of a break, but when we come back, we'll be answering your gardening questions. Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. While we were taking a little bit of a break, Adriana and Rick and I were talking about Steady Eddy viburnum. And Adriana, who, if you didn't know, is also our videographer and photographer for Proven Winners Killer Choice Shrubs, said that it's one of the plants that she can't stop taking pictures of because every time she walks by it, whether it's in the greenhouse or somewhere in our trial gardens, it just always looks so good that her camera loves it, and we all love it. So if that's the kind of plant you're looking for, Steady Eddy viburnum, look for it at your local garden center.
The plant's a show-off and knows a great photographer when it walks by.
I guess you could say it works both ways like that. So this is the part of the show where we answer your gardening questions. We are in the full swing of gardening season. So Rick, what do we got in the mailbag today?
Well, Diane writes to us, planted 2 double play doozy spireas. I love those. They're so beautiful. In full sun with amended soil and mulched well. They were planted a week ago. Today they look wilted. Temperature is 82 degrees. I'm in zone 7B. Will they adapt to full sun? And if so, is there anything I can do to help get them established? Or do I move them now to an afternoon shade location? They were in full bloom when planted.
So thank you so much for your question, Diane. Double Play Doozy is also an extremely innovative flowering shrub that also comes from Dr. Rainey in North Carolina State. And it is, you could almost think of it like the spirea version of Steady Eddy, and that it also blooms pretty much continuously. Yeah. So a really great plant, again, if you just want a lot of flowers. So Diane's question, I think, is an interesting one. And, I have talked to gardeners over the years, answered tons and tons of questions. And when they've sent me pictures and said, oh, it's wilting, does it need more water? Is it getting too much sun? I always have to ask, how much are you watering it? Because one of the really tricky things about a situation like this is that a lot of plants will wilt if they are overwatered or underwatered. And it really takes kind of a finely trained eye to see the difference. And I can discern that from a photo now, typically. But, to someone who is not used to seeing plants all the time and thinking about plants all the time, it can be very, very difficult to tell the difference between wilting from overwatering and wilting from underwatering. So, Diane, before you dig anything up or do anything like that, I would encourage you to get out there and see what's actually going on in the soil. Now, only the trick about answering these kinds of questions is only the person asking it really knows how much water it's getting. I mean, I don't know how much water it's getting, even if it's rained, which we haven't had much rain here in Michigan. You still don't know if it's actually, reaching the plant and saturating the soil in the root ball. So you really are the one to know if you have a sprinkler system, if it's hitting it sufficiently, if you've been watering by hand, how much water it's getting. And if you aren't sure, then all you have to do is, take your finger, take a trowel, and just dig around a little bit just outside where the root ball is. And that will give you a pretty quick idea of how moist the soil is.
Well, and Diane mentioned amended soil, and I'd like to mention again that when you dig the hole, don't throw amended soil in a hole and then put the plant in. Rather, mix it 50-50 with the existing parent soil. That's going to help with the watering too and sensing how much water the plant needs. Plants do experience transplant shock. And often they'll show that via leaf scorch, especially if the weather is, well, she's saying 82 degrees. There are good water-soluble starter fertilizers also because, Stacy, I guess the whole key here is giving this plant a little time to establish roots in the soil.
Right, and really investigating what's going on. If you did amend and it wasn't thoroughly mixed, that can hold a lot more moisture around the root ball, as we've talked about before. So, Diane, the answer to your question is that you're going to need to go out there, first of all, and explore not deep down in the soil, but a few inches into the soil. See how moist it is, see if it's dry. And I think that will help to answer your question. I don't think that in USDA Zone 7, that you should have to move double play doozy at all. I think it should do just fine in full sun, particularly if it's mulched. So I would say look at what is happening with the water, and this is for Diane and anyone else. If your plant is wilting, don't just automatically assume it needs more water. There could be other things at play, so make sure you dig around in the soil before you act.
And I've done this before, Diane, and that is, you mentioned it was planted 1 week ago. When we have problems with a plant, I've gotten to the point where I have dug it up.
Yeah.
And taken a look so that I'm sure of what's going on down there and then replanted it if it's only been planted a week ago.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea at all.
We got a note from Keddy wondering, we purchased a load of topsoil to fill new raised garden beds around our home. The soil was full of tiny bulbs that produced flat, variegated foliage, not wild onions. While I'm trying to remove the bulbs by digging them out, I know I'm not getting them all. Will I keep the soil too moist for my panicle hydrangeas if I put cardboard under the mulch to hopefully suppress the weeds? The soil type is silt, and we're talking about Zone 7, Tennessee.
And the plant that you planted is a little lime punch panicle hydrangea. And I think I've said on the show before that panicle hydrangeas are definitely one of those plants that can be very sensitive to too much moisture in the soil, and particularly conditions where there's too much moisture in the soil because of landscape fabric or thick layers of mulch keeping that in. So I would say tentatively yes, but you're going to want to make sure that this cardboard is kept well away from your panicle hydrangea.
Sure.
I would say a good 2 feet around that panicle hydrangea. And the other thing, to know here is that the cardboard will decompose. And you're in Tennessee, USDA Zone 7, so a pretty humid climate, pretty warm climate. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I don't think that cardboard's going to last long enough in the Tennessee climate to actually do any weed suppression. What do you think?
Yeah, probably not, because we're talking about bulbous weeds. Now, it was mentioned here, not wild onions, but maybe it's Muscari grape hyacinths or crocus or striped squill, whatever it may be. And with something like that, if you do get to the some point where you decide to use an herbicide to knock them back, rough them up a little bit before you spray the herbicide. It'll make it more effective for a bulbous type weed, which can be difficult to eradicate.
They can be, and my first thought, when I hear a bulbous weed, my first thought is ornithogalum, also known as Star of Bethlehem.
Star of Bethlehem, yeah.
I got a couple of those in my yard that I've got to dig up this week before they do become even more of a pest. And I could easily see that being the issue here. And it is going to take some time, and it's going to be difficult. But I think you can go through the work of putting the cardboard down, leave the clearance for the hydrangeas, but you might just want to consider putting that effort into a different method, since I really don't think in a warm, humid climate, the cardboard will last long enough to do the job.
Thanks for your question. Let's get to this. Jim writes to us, we have 5 beautiful, incredible hydrangeas exhibiting the same problem of pairs of leaves rolled into pillows and fused together. They're organic gardeners, want to support wildlife, so want to avoid killing the caterpillars, but they want to protect the plants, ensure the blooms. What do they do here? And this is a great question because this is something we do see.
Yeah, we do see it. I think that it has been increasing for a lot of people. And the short answer here is that what you're seeing there, Jim, is the hydrangea leaf tire. And I'm always glad when I can talk about this problem rather than write about it, because if you write it, it's hydrangea leaf tier, like a tier of a cake or something like that, T-I-E-R. And then people are always like, a hydrangea leaf tier? What in the world do you mean? But it's leaf tire, because as Jim could unfortunately tell you, what this little caterpillar does is it makes a cozy little home for itself, or a pillow in his words, by taking the silk that it would use to like spin a cocoon or something like that, and literally tying the uppermost pair of leaves specifically on hydrangea arborescens, so smooth hydrangeas or Annabelle type hydrangeas. And that's not surprising. Why? Because that is actually a native species for us. Hydrangea arborescens grows abundantly throughout the southeast. In fact, last year I was on a vacation to the southeast and saw one growing wild in a Waffle House parking lot.
Oh, the Waffle House!
Just to show you how ubiquitous the plant is. So when we have a plant like that that's native, it's not surprising that there are these native pests. So they're pretty easy to manage without spraying. I would honestly just spend 15 minutes busting those things open. If you want, you can squish them with your hand. If not, all you have to do is open them up, and the birds will be only too glad to swoop in and pick out those little caterpillars in there.
I agree with you, because it's unsightly, but it isn't necessarily going to kill the plants. We just want these caterpillars to retire.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you do want to do that sooner than later, because this first generation here, it's not really typically going to cause a lot of harm to the flowers, because the flower buds are still quite tiny for those of us in cold climates. But as the season progresses, if those caterpillars are allowed to get larger and the bud is getting larger, then they might start to damage the flower bud. Right now, they're just eating the little leaf tissue in there. So bust them open. If you want to crush the caterpillars with your fingers, you can. But like I said, otherwise the birds will probably be able to take care of it for you if you do them the courtesy of opening up those tied up leaves. So if you have a gardening question for us, we would be delighted to help you. All you have to do is email us at HELP at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, or visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. We've got to take a break, but when we come back, we've got a guest, and it's going to be all about pollinators. So please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show. It's time for branching news, not breaking news. And today's branching news, we want to talk about pollinators. Earlier, we were talking about annuals, bright, colorful annuals, and drawing pollinators and bees to your yard. And I thought, what better person to talk to than my friend, Honey Tree Arborist Services, Mike Connor. He's a lifetime beekeeper, bee enthusiast. When I say lifetime, Mike, can I share that's like 50 plus years? Is that correct?
I've had bees for 50 plus years. Yep. You can do the math, Rick.
Well, we're kind of in the same group. Mike Connor. Mike, thanks so much for joining us here on the Gardening Simplified show. And I knew immediately that I needed to interview you on the show because just like Stacy, you are a huge fan of Seven Sons Temple of Bloom Heptacodium.
I am. I'm so glad. And Stacy, I'm glad to hear that you're a fan too.
All right, we have good taste.
It's a great tree. And I wish that there were more of them out there. You've got to do your job promoting these. I try to.
Yeah. No, it's true. And of course, it suffers from something that a lot of really fantastic landscape plants have, which is it blooms late in the season. So, of course, right now it's May, everybody's at the garden center. And then, unfortunately, traffic kind of drops off and people don't realize that they're walking by a plant that's going to give them so much later in the season, not just aesthetically, but, as you, of course, know, for the bees and pollinators as well.
Let's talk about that for just a moment, because we have so many things in bloom right now. Just dozens and dozens of plants and flowers and trees are in bloom right now. And then when it comes to the middle of the summer, there's not much in terms of trees. There's not much in terms of spectacular except maybe Rose of Sharon. And in September, Temple of Bloom, the Heptacodium, Seven Suns, comes into full bloom, and it is absolutely a pollinator magnet. And I was telling Rick earlier that we stopped at a resort community on Lake Michigan last year, and it was September, and there was a Seven Suns that someone had planted, and there were literally thousands of pollinators on that single tree, including hundreds of monarch butterflies.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And that's a good selling point because monarchs have to feed as they travel down from up north all the way to Mexico. And what do we have for them to feed on? Well, they can feed on goldenrod. They can feed on whatever else is in bloom at the time. But this Heptacodium just seems to draw them by the hundreds. And I think we could promote those just as a monarch friendly plant in the fall.
Yeah.
No, I'm marking that down. And another great thing about it is because it is a tree, it's not a super tall tree, but that's a great thing for people who are afraid of bees, who know that they're beneficial, but still have that lingering fear that some of us develop in childhood. Not me, not Rick, not Adriana, but some people. And so they're way up there. So you're giving them all that benefit, but they're not, right down there at eye level where they're scaring your kids and scaring your pets.
Stacy, you make such a great point. And since I've known Mike is a guy whose mantra is save a bee, plant a tree.
Oh, I love that.
And if you think about it with trees, this is something Mike taught me. Whatever time of the year it is, we talked about Temple of Bloom, but if you talk about alder or red maple early in the year, we get a chance to go vertical, just like Maverick in Top Gun. Let's go vertical, let's go ballistic. And Mike, whether it's the red maples or let's say linden trees as an example, you're a guy who really promotes this, what Stacy mentioned, because it's an opportunity to be very efficient with space and provide for our pollinators.
And that's very, very important. When you look at a meadow that people will plant for pollinators or a pollinator garden, it may take up several hundred square feet for a pollinator garden. And if you were to count the blossoms in that pollinator garden, I think you'd be surprised when you compare that to a tree, that a tree with a footprint of a foot and a half, can have a larger number of blossoms than a field of pollinator plants. And they're all out at once. They're producing nectar and pollen all at once, which is what bees need to gather a crop. And Stacy, I don't know if you know this, that it takes 2 million flower visits for bees to make 1 pound of honey.
Wow.
And you just don't get 2 million flowers in a small space or on a catmint or on a small landscape plant, but you can get 2 million flowers on a couple of trees that are in your backyard. And that's really significant.
Well, the thing about lindens, and lindens are one of my hands down favorite trees.
Oh, I love them.
And even though they're spectacular in flower, a lot of people don't really realize that they're even blooming. They might smell the fragrance in the air, but they don't look at a linden and go, oh, wow, that's in flower. That's really supporting bees. They'll look at a meadow and go, oh, yeah, great for the bees. And I think it's, what you're saying is such a good thing for people to learn and internalize, and that is that planting trees and supporting tree health is such a crucial part of saving not just honeybees, but all pollinators.
Absolutely. And, the linden tree, we don't necessarily see those flowers unless, like it's a little leaf linden and there may be millions and millions of flowers and they overwhelm the leaves. But the flowers on a lot of trees come out after the leaves do. The exception would be red maples and pussy willows and those early spring flowers. But when the leaves come out, then we don't notice those flowers. We can smell them, but we may not necessarily see them. But those trees have thousands, hundreds of thousands of blossoms on them, and the bees are actively working them. You don't even know it. Those bees are up high. The bees are doing their thing. They're pollinating the flowers and gathering nectar.
Mike, remind me, and don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm sure you know about this. Wasn't it linden trees that were inappropriately sprayed somewhere in the Northwest that caused this whole movement as far as Save the Bees is concerned? There was an incident a number of years ago, correct?
There was a landscaper inadvertently sprayed, I believe they were little leaf lindens for Japanese beetles,
Okay.
and used an imidacloprid product, if I recall correctly, and that's just absolutely toxic to the bees. And it not only affected the bees, but it affected the bumblebees. And the bumblebees, the native bees, are working these trees too. And I think that's where the outcry came from. There was some false press on that. Some people came out and said, well, linden pollen is toxic to bees, and that's what killed them. No, it was the spray that killed them. If the linden pollen and nectar was toxic to the bees, then there wouldn't be much point in the bees going to them and pollinating them.
Sure.
And
Sure.
I know there are some exceptions, but yeah, that was a horrible incident, and I think it raised people's awareness, of a chemical being improperly applied. Had they waited until the flowers were gone, then there would not have been any bees in the tree.
Right.
And they could have had gypsy moth. They could have had, what was the pest again, Rick? Japanese beetle. They would have had
beetles,
Japanese
right.
beetle control.
Right.
And if they would have done it after the bloom, then there would not have been that horrible die-off.
Yeah, you bet. Now, on a happier note, there are things that our viewers and listeners can do to attract pollinators to their yard. I was looking at a list that you had created, Mike, and we mentioned earlier Stacy's favorite, Temple of Bloom, and I noticed one of Adriana's favorites, Miss Molly Budleia, is a plant that you like.
I do. I really, really like that. And this is not a plug for Proven Winners, but I'll tell you, they've really got some good stuff out there for pollinators. The Miss Molly butterfly bush is great. Sugar Shack button bush is another one that's great. An incredibly, incredibly important plant is the Caryopteris, the Beyond Midnight cultivar. That just draws bees by the thousands. And that's another fall bloomer.
Yeah.
Bees and butterflies and bumblebees, native bees. Not all of these things are just all about honeybees. A lot of these things are about our native bees and our butterflies. And we have to take a broad approach on these and say, we're going to plant something for all the pollinators. And hey, you know what? If the beekeeper gets a honey crop off it, that's better yet.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's sometimes I feel a little bit personally indignant that the honeybees do get all the attention because it's like people only care because it's affecting their personal food source and not really understanding how, the whole ecology that our native bees play in our role really supports our entire food system and basically our entire ecosystem.
Yeah, generally, if we say that a plant is good for a honeybee, it's almost always good for the native bees. Now, it's not always a reverse of that. Black cherry is not necessarily good for our honeybees because they're not that attracted to it. But black cherry is very attractive to our native bees. And so we can plant that and enjoy the beauty of the flower.
So many plants, so many trees, shrubs that we can enjoy and plant for pollinators. Mike, Stacy, and I often talk about this, but avoiding a monoculture, there are so many opportunities, great opportunities, and we're looking for those blooming opportunities all season long, and we can do that with the variety that's available today.
We sure can, and that's a very important point. I think municipalities have finally caught on that if you plant a whole streetscape to elm, you're going to pay for it. And then to replace those elm with ash, well, that was probably not a smart thing to do. And then after the ash died, they put in Cleveland Select pears.
Oof.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, okay, we have to learn that monoculture is not necessarily good. It may look good, but if we need diversity for our wildlife, for our bees, and we need to be able to provide something for all the pollinators, and in succession, red maples in the spring, followed by pussy willows, followed by the sumacs, followed by the crab apples. All of these things come in succession, and then all of these things offer a continuous supply of nectar and pollen for our pollinators. And that's really important.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Mike Connor. His name is Mike Connor, Honey Tree Arborist Services, a lifelong beekeeper, bee enthusiast. Mike, you always inspire me when we chat, and we want to thank you for joining us today on the Gardening Simplified show.
It's been my pleasure. I really appreciate your interest in pollinators. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
I told you he means business.
He sure does.
He does. Thanks so much, Mike.
Wow, that was great. I am so inspired and so glad it's the weekend so I can get out there and do some planting myself.
Me too. Can't wait. Can't wait to plant.
And we wish you all happy planting. Thanks to Rick, thanks to Adriana, and thanks to Mike for joining us. Have a wonderful week and a week ahead.